I'm clicking. I'm good at computers, guys. There we go. All right, I think this is how this works. All right. Hello. Today, I'm going to talk about PostCSS. I'm Nathan. I was in engineering guild group for about 4.5 years. Recently departed. I've been working on a startup called PhotoOp for the last year. And the last few weeks, I'm actually looking for my next opportunity. So I'm kind of fun employed at the moment. You guys see that in the back? I don't know if it's big enough. So I looked at sort of like the previous subject matter of this meetup, and it seems to be sort of JavaScript focused, which is fine. I like JavaScript too. But tonight we're going to be talking about cascading style sheets. Right? Does anybody remember 1996? Right?
Big snowstorm. It's going to happen again.
It was a big snowstorm. Bob Dole wanted to be the president. Jerry Maguire quotes abounded. And there was the information superhighway. And the W3C recommended CSS level 1 so we could stop inlining CSS into our HTML files. Right? It was a very exciting time. It didn't actually get all that much traction until years later. Who remembers CSS Zen-Guard? I mean, it's still a thing. It's like still around. But in 2000, yeah, it's still a thing. There are now hundreds and hundreds of CSS Zen-Garden templates. But the first one showed up in 2003 when Dave Shea showed us how cool CSS could be, right? With all of its sort of like floating and non-capitalizing HTML tags. I think I am recording.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Go for it. Thanks.
I'm recording for you in the future. All right. Yeah. So this is a snippet from the very first template, CSS Zen-Garden, and really it was just floating divs instead of doing table-based layouts. It was very revolutionary. So CSS is a declarative language. Welcome. Read repetitive, right? And so using the Tim Berners-Lee rule of least power sort of philosophy, right? It's simple, it's sort of accessible for like a large group of people to sort of contribute to it, but it is kind of static and repetitive, right? So in doing things like creating specificity, right? We end up like repeating ourselves for things like colors, fonts, margins, sort of values in CSS. We tend to repeat ourselves kind of a lot, right? But we're developers, we're engineers, we're programmers, right? So we fixed it. We're like, I hate repeating myself. I don't want to do this stuff. So in 2005, the Ruby community was like, we got to solve for this, and we fixed it with Sass, right? And so we created things like variables. We created things like nesting. We created things like mix-ins, right? The ability to take a group of styles and sort of like generally apply it to sort of like different other styles, right? And then in 2009, Node was blowing up. People were like, look at this, we can write JavaScript for more than just a browser. And somebody fixed it again using less, right? And so we had variables, and we had mixed-ins, and we had nesting, and we had like sort of like various things that we could do, right? Looks pretty much the same. And then in 2011, a young man by the name of TJ Holloway-Chuck was like, oh, let's fix this again because I hate punctuation. Right? So let's do the exact same thing where we'll have variables and we'll have nesting, we'll have mix-ins without all those nonsensical semicolons and punctuation, right? Looks dope. He also wrote Jade, so if you're into Jade, it looks very much the same. So problem solved, right? We have preprocessors. We have solved all the problems that CSS could present us, and here we stand in a perfect CSS harmony, right? And we have no problems with CSS, which is why so many people enjoy writing CSS. That's not exactly the case. For the last, I guess, 6 or 7 years, right, we've seen the rise of preprocessors. It's almost laughable to think about authoring CSS at any scale without a preprocessor, right? No one really hand codes CSS anymore. And we have really powerful features like sort of mix-ins, nesting, imports, and sort of like a way to sort of create style sheets without repeating ourselves, and like sort of making it match the complexity of software that we're creating for the browser these days, right? Now, I don't know about you, but in 2011, I guess, I started using less because Guilt told me that we're using less now, and so all of my style sheets were authored in less. And as a developer, as a programmer, my first inclination was, all right, look at all these powerful features. I'm going to use all these features. All right? I'm going to nest this stuff and make it look just like the DOM that it represents. Isn't that so nice? Kind of made it a little over-specific, but that's okay. I'm going to use variables. I'm going to use import statements. I'm going to use like conditionals and loops and all kinds of crazy things, right? That was super fun and super powerful. But if I actually looked at the style sheets I was actually compiling, they were bigger, they were heavier, they were bulkier, they were sort of over-specific, right? And so the JavaScript community and front-end developers know something about taking sort of the power and the wealth of a language and sort of paring it down to just the best parts and just the best patterns, right? And so this is like sort of a concept we're familiar with. And so when it came to things like Sass or Less or Stylus, sort of like those same sort of attitudes could be applied. You know, maybe nesting more than like 3 levels deep creates this over-specificity that's not actually all that good, right? Maybe using the extends keyword in Sass is a really hard concept to get our head around, and maybe we're just better off without it, right? And so we chose the good parts of preprocessors, right? So that was like sort of a first step. A few years back, I remember sort of having lots and lots of... Please, come in. Come on in, man. See right there. All right. Years ago, I had a lot of conversations at Guild where we had built jQuery, and we like sort of had lots and lots of jQuery and plugins. I'm sure you guys all remember the golden years of plugin authoring, right? And we had this sort of like big pile of jQuery monolith, and we had Ajax and Ferds, and jQuery was getting quite large, and we started wondering about rolling our own and taking sort of smaller pieces of functionality and sort of composing them together. And then we got things like, I'm trying to think of David DeSandro's thing, I forgot. No, before that. Ender.js, right? And we got like some Zepto and like smaller libs that kind of came out of that, and sort of micro.js up here. And I remember for a while, I was like looking to break out of jQuery, and I would go to micro.js and like see what the smallest thing is, and like, can I have JavaScript that's only the functionality I need, and compose those things together. And recently, right, sort of with the rise of larger and even more complicated sort of client-side MVCs, we've seen sort of competition amongst how we're going to sort of create these ecosystems, right? And behind me I have sort of Angular and React, but we also have players like Ember and Knockout, and there's sort of other various things. But the philosophies behind these things typically tend to be, do we want a sort of all-encompassing, opinionated ecosystem that sort of like provides all the solutions we could ever need, or do we want something sort of small, more focused, more flexible, but with lots more choices to make, lots more patterns to establish, and sort of like how do we go about solving these questions, right? So back to your giant sort of monolithic preprocessor that we have sort of at the moment, be it a Sass or a Less. What if you don't want to use all of the features of your preprocessor? Well, you can just stop using all the features of your preprocessor, right? It's pretty quite simple. But how do we go about adding features, right? What if we want to extend Sass, or what if we want to extend Less, right? What if we want to like increase the wealth of what it does? These are open source projects. I mean, we could sort of like fork and pull requests, but we all know sort of like how that's fraught, and then you got to sort of deal with that complexity. Or we could sort of like additionally script sort of things, and then you end up with like a proprietary solution, and there's not really whatever, right? But this is exactly the sort of like problem that people have tried to attack in the past few years. So TJ Holloway Chuck, Canadian node darling turned Go developer who wrote hundreds and hundreds of things on NPM that I'm sure we all still use every day, was the author of Stylus in 2011, and in 2013 he had a better idea, right? He came up with something called Rework, and in the article on his blog where he sort of introduced this idea, He said, rework caters to a different audience and provide you the flexibility to craft the preprocessor you want, not the choices the authors have forced on you. And a few years later, a guy by the name of Andrey Sitnik did the same thing with a product called PostCSS, right? Because Rework was a proof of concept. It was the first generation of modular CSS processing. With PostCSS, we've learned to have a better parser, a better API, and better source map support, right? So PostCSS is that sort of idea of sort of constructing modules together a la Rework, but with a better API, smaller, faster, better. But what does that actually mean, right? So what are we actually talking about? What is Rework and how does it actually work? So it works by effectively taking a CSS source, right? So the style sheets that you write, right? It's sort of like globbing them together a la your gulp or whatever. And all it is it's a parser, right? So it takes that CSS, parses it into an AST, and then provides an API for plugins to sort of manipulate that AST. And then sort of when it finishes, it writes it back into CSS, right? And so PostCSS or Rework by themselves doesn't actually do anything, right? It just gives you a way to sort of like manipulate your own source, right? So all the power is really in the plugins, right? So because we're JavaScript developers and we like looking at code, here's a little code, right? So again, this is like in a node vacuum, right? We require PostCSS. It takes an argument of an array of plugins that are also required. We call the process method. And then the result here is just a string of CSS, right? And so there's no magic. PostCSS itself is actually super small, super simple, and actually itself not that powerful. The power really lies in the incredibly simple API provided in the plugins, right? So this is a plugin that's not actually doing anything, but effectively it's a function that takes in CSS, which is a CSS AST, right? And it has you call walk rules, and you sort of walk over the rules that are provided in the AST, and then walk the declarations, and then change those declarations however you see fit, right? Giving it back to PostCSS at the end to be stringified and written back to files. So what can we do with this? What's possible, right? So it's like kind of a different mental model. Maybe you don't really get it. So the idea is that we can replace Sass. Sass, the monolith, which is sort of like one large piece of software that's controlled by a sort of a governing open source body, and we can sort of replace it with smaller, more modular plugins that we can either choose to use or not use. There is sort of like one big plugin to replace Sass, but as a conversation piece, here are just some PostCSS plugins that sort of provide the basic functionality of a given preprocessor, right? So the way I actually discovered PostCSS is not by finding out about PostCSS, but it's actually by looking at CSS Next, right? So once back in the summer when I decided that it was time to sort of like embrace Babel and ES6 and only write in sort of future-facing syntax, I was like, I probably should consider doing the same for CSS. I was seeing sort of more and more CSS4 sort of popping up in various projects, and I was like, it's time to embrace the future, right? So looking at CSS Next, and all it is it's a plugin or a set of plugins that are bundled that run on PostCSS to sort of parse this future CSS syntax that's more or less the CSS4 standard that's being sort of evaluated by the W3C and sort of compile down to CSS similar to Babel that does sort of ES6 to ES5, right? And so CSS Next gives us some sort of future-facing features that are currently not available and not possible in Sass less Stylus, like custom properties and var, which I guess we kind of get custom media queries, media query ranges, custom selectors, the any link matches not, and sort of like stuff that's still kind of being debated about if you want to play with it today. So we can replace the current sort of functionality of our preprocessors with PostCSS, right? That's pretty interesting and pretty powerful, but it's like, why would I replace this one thing with yet another thing, right? But with PostCSS, we can actually extend the power of our current sort of preprocessor. And here are some examples of like providing fallbacks for CSS, right? So if we author regular CSS, so for CSS Grace, if we offer sort of opacity.6 and display inline, we run it through CSS Grace and we get filter and some sort of like hacks that you may or may not need for IE7 depending on what it is you want to support, right? Auto prefixer, how many people have heard of auto prefixer, right? That is probably by far the most famous of the PostCSS plugins, and it's quite simple. It actually takes any sort of property that needs a vendor prefix and it adds a vendor prefix, right? So for display flex or transition, it goes back and it's configurable to sort of how far back you need to vendor prefix based on the can I use database, right? So if you want to go back one version of browsers or 6 versions or 10 versions, and if you only want to prefix certain attributes, all of that's sort of configurable using auto prefixer. But we can do lots of other things with our CSS and not just, as I say, sort of adding features. There's tons of optimization and analysis that we can also do on our CSS without actually changing it, right? So plugins like Do I Use, which will query the Can I Use database and tell you which browsers you're supporting and which browsers you're not supporting with your current CSS. PostCSS Colorblind will actually spit out a different set of CSS so you can see what your site looks like in different sort of like colorblind categories. Color Guard to go and check every single color declaration and make sure that they are a part of the sort of like set standard color palette. CSS Nano for minification, and PostCSS Stats. If you've ever seen CSSstats.com, it basically takes your CSS, queries it against CSS Stats, and gives you sort of like reporting about what it is you're doing. And if you feel like all of this sort of like fun, serious business is too much, and you want to like sort of lower your efficiency a little bit, there's also a couple plugins out there for like pranks and jokes and just being stupid, right? PostCSS Trolling, which is hilarious, but it's such a terrible idea, will actually go and destroy your code base by doing things like adding things like slightly blinking text or like slightly rotating your text in certain different ways. Perfect for April Fool's Day, or if you just need to like mess things up a little bit. Or if you feel like authoring CSS like an angsty teenager, lolcats basically changes all these syntax from regular English into sort of child speak that you see on social media. I don't know. A little older for that.
Say Doge, man.
That's right.
Doge
Exactly.
and smile.
Ask your nieces and nephews.
No one needs to know what it means.
That's right. So there are currently a couple of hundred PostCSS plugins out there, but if you can't find what you're looking for amongst the hundreds of currently existing PostCSS plugins, you can totally create your own, right? The API is super simple, and the PostCSS community has worked very hard to actually make it as easy as possible to sort of get into plugin authoring, right? There are several tutorials out there that are really, really slick. There's an AST Explorer, so you can actually walk through the CSS tree and see what the properties are, and there's a super well documented API, so you can jump right in. So, how do I do this, Nathan, I hear you say, right? So, I think I threw something similar up before. If you live in a perfect world where you don't use a build tool and you only use Node to sort of compile your CSS, it's very simple. We require PostCSS. We require whatever plugins we need. We call process, and then sort of like dump it back out to a file. Super simple, but probably you don't live in a world where you don't use a build tool, right? So there are versions of a plugin for Grunt, right, called Grunt PostCSS. Same sort of thing, right? We call Grunt, we pass in our things, and we set source and destination. Almost exactly the same thing for Gulp. There is a Gulp PostCSS. And there is a ton of support. There's support for build tools that I've actually never even heard of, right? So if you need a brunch or a broccoli, if you want to use it just in Express without any kind of build system, right? It'll actually just take it and do that. It's providing some middleware for PostCSS. So there's tons and tons of options for how you can sort of like get PostCSS into your project or into your build system. But perhaps you have an existing code base in Sass or Less or Stylus, and you don't want to just throw it out the window and re-author hundreds and hundreds of styles. Fair enough. PostCSS actually works really, really well with most currently existing preprocessors, right? So if you're using Sass in Grunt, right, or Gulp, we can literally just run it through Sass and attach this to the end, right? So if we want to extend features in Sass, or if we want to do optimization and analysis, it's just one more thing in our build system, right? So we just add it to sort of the tail end of the pipe, and we have PostCSS, and we can sort of leverage that power without changing it. It's sort of exactly the same thing for Less, like it's literally the same thing. And if you're using Stylus, it's slightly more difficult. Is anyone actually using Stylus? Has anyone ever used or heard of Stylus? There we go. We got a couple guys in the back there. It's a little bit more difficult, but they've provided sort of a plugin so you can drop it right into your Stylus toolchain. Yeah, so PostCSS, I think, is definitely the way of the future, right? It's tapping into sort of this mindset of large sort of monolithic thing and breaking it down into sort of more flexible modules that give you sort of better control on how you want to author and the features that you want to have in your CSS, which I think lines up very well with what we've seen happening with something like an NPM or something happening in sort of various JavaScript communities. PostCSS is so much faster than even libsass. I think I saw like some sort of benchmarking where it's something like a third or a fourth the time to like process CSS. So it's so fast. It is so light, mostly because it's only parsing into an AST and then exposing an API. It's very tiny. You get the strength of modularity, like I say. There is a wealth and ever-increasing sort of like set of plugins out there, and plugin authoring is like so easy. And I think it's the natural evolution to how we're going to author CSS in the future. And if you get nothing else from this talk, at least start using auto prefixing, right? Because it is so golden and so strong, and I think like Google and Facebook and like everybody's using it now. It's become like sort of the de facto standard. So do yourself a favor and never write a vendor prefix ever again, right? All right, that's me. I'm Nathan. I'm on the internet, so feel free to look me up. Thanks for listening. That was